Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to now the 15th seminar in our ISCIA Games and Play series. Today's presentation has got this wonderfully intriguing title, The Serious Man and the Mushroom, a Mycelial Ethics of Care. It'll be presented by Anzel Loubser, who invites us now to think about ethics itself as a kind of game. Although maybe a game whose dominant traditions have forgotten that the rules are in fact rules and therefore might be questioned or disrupted or played differently. Maybe more play than game then. So drawing on her doctoral research, Anzel explores what might happen if ethical thought were to move less like a kind of a straight line and more like a mushroom, more like mycelium, spreading kind of outwards and laterally and forming these unexpected connections and refusing to remain neatly within prescribed boundaries. Her proposed mycelial ethics of care brings Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomatic philosophy into conversation with the phenomenology of psilocybin experience and selected Southern African indigenous ways of knowing. So she asks whether we might imagine ethical relations between human and non-human life in a more playful, kind of relational and ecologically responsive way. Anzel lectures in philosophy, and she is a PhD candidate at Nelson Mandela University, also in philosophy. Her research moves across this fascinating range of fields, including complexity, post-colonial thought, forest ecology, philosophy through film, trauma, existentialist ethics, and the ethics of care. And of course, if you're thinking about the serious man, then Simone de Beauvoir. So at the heart of her current work is the question of how we might kind of move beyond the image of ourselves as these isolated sovereign individuals and learn instead to live relationally in a world marked by ambiguity and ecological precarity. It's a difficult task, that one. So I think we can expect today's seminar to take us kind of off the program a little bit, maybe into some productively strange and fertile territory. So Anzel, thank you. Lovely to have you here. And over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Awesome. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. You really could be anywhere on a Friday at 2:30, and yet you are here with me. So thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to chat with you all about something that is very meaningful to me, a mycelial ethics of care. Over the course of the session, I'd like you to imagine my proposed doctoral project, A Mycelial Ethics of Care, as thought play, ethical thinking that wanders laterally and rhizomatically off the program. So, get ready for a bit of intergalactic space travel. Onward, let us journey together. My doctoral project develops a relational ethics of care grounded in a philosophical paradigm of mycelial thinking. The central research problem of this project concerns the inadequacy of dominant ethical systems for taking the non-human world seriously as a domain of relational significance. Dominant traditions of normative ethics are organized around an implicitly atomistic subject. This subject is bounded and sovereign and given metaphysical form in Cartesian dualism. The care ethics tradition has challenged this conception of the subject, but arguably remains oriented toward the interpersonal and the human. The ecological literature has extended this challenge toward the non-human world, but without developing the methodological specificity that a philosophical ethics of care requires, drawing on philosophical entanglements that include posthumanism, ecological ethics, rhizomatic theory, fungal ecology, and psychedelic phenomenology. This project aims to fill that gap by arguing that dominant ethical models remain constrained by atomistic conceptions of the subject. In response, my thesis proposes a mycelial heuristic of care to rethink ethical relations between human and non-human life. And it contextualizes this alternative configuration within the ecological and political conditions of post-apartheid South Africa. The project positions this heuristic as a guiding sensibility within an alternative tradition of ethical thinking associated with existentialist and relational philosophers who reject reducing morality to universal principles and instead ask how free, embodied beings might live responsibly under conditions of ambiguity. The mycelial heuristic extends this orientation toward the non-human world, drawing on Merlin Sheldrake's mycorrhizal ecology and Anna Tsing's account of collaborative survival, and drawing on phenomenological literature concerning psilocybin experience as an encounter that enacts at the level of consciousness the relational dissolution of ego boundary that the mycelial model articulates. As Anna Tsing observes, we live in an age marked by the spread of alienation that turn humans and other beings into resources. Insofar as neoliberal capitalism has divided society sociopolitically and rendered the non-human world invisible as a domain of ethical significance, reducing it to raw material for human projects. So there is a discord between ecological existence and societies that are not ecological, which are structured around dominant social systems, hierarchies, and collective habits of mind that lack relational qualities. These are shaped by unecological philosophical traditions that tend to be atomized, separatist, hierarchical, static, and substantialist. As Deleuze and Guattari note, such traditions function around the arborescent model, since the tree has dominated Western reality and all of Western thought, from botany to biology and anatomy, but also gnoseology, theology, ontology, and all of philosophy, establishing hierarchies and fixed identities as the conditions of knowledge and moral value. Deleuze describes an expression of this orientation in difference and repetition as the dogmatic image of thought. The dogmatic image of thought is an implicit and largely unexamined picture of what it means to think. This picture is organized around the presupposition of a unified, self-identical subject in whom the faculties agree and through whom self-identical objects are recognized. It is this image that produces the atomistic conception of the subject, which is bounded and sovereign, and which dominant ethical traditions inherit. The arborescent model is its spatial form. Therefore, the target of this project's critique is this structural image of which Cartesian dualism is a modern instance. Arguably, the Cartesian division of res cogitans from res extensa gives the atomistic subject metaphysical form, establishing a hierarchy that locates rational and ethical significance exclusively in the domain of consciousness, thereby rendering the non-human world philosophically mute, making it available for use and extraction, but not for moral consideration. Vandana Shiva's concept of monocultures of the mind identifies the political and ecological consequences of this through the reduction of the non-human world to a single register of value, the economic. Much as colonial monoculture reduces agricultural diversity to a single crop. However, Western philosophy has never been uniformly Cartesian, and the care ethics tradition that this project extends emerged within Western thought itself. This can be identified, for example, in Gilligan's challenge to Kohlbergian moral psychology, in Tronto's political account of care, and in Puig de la Bella Casa's multi-species extension of the tradition. Therefore, the project does not claim that the philosophy of Descartes alone is responsible for ecological ruin, but rather it traces a particular line of dominant influence. It also pays attention to the consolidation of Cartesian dualism into the scientific, political, economic, and legal structures of modernity, and whose effects can be identified in the specific conditions of post-apartheid South Africa. Post-apartheid South Africa is the primary location of application for this project. The colonial Cartesian legacy can be identified, for example, in the acid mine drainage of Gauteng, in the monoculture agriculture of the former Bantustans, in the legal structures that criminalize indigenous relationships with the non-human world, and in the institutional structures that perpetuate the epistemic marginalization of non-Western knowledge traditions. The criminalization of psilocybin under the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act and the Medicines and Related Substances Act reflects a privileging of rational scientific knowledge over embodied relational knowledge. Moreover, it reflects a corresponding suppression of indigenous practices that predate the colonial legal system. However, the project does not argue that indigenous cosmologies, practices, and the use of psilocybin are some kind of panacea for global problems, but rather that they are knowledge systems and experiences, although criminalized, that offer insight into interrelational interdependence as an alternative ontology to Cartesian reductionism. My study argues for a reconfiguration of the relationship between subject and other on ethical grounds within philosophy by proposing a novel scaffold. A mycelial ethics of care is understood as a philosophical heuristic, insofar as it is a structured way of asking what it would mean to take the non-human world seriously in ethical thought. The mycorrhizal network known as the wood wide web of fungal filaments, through which trees and plants share nutrients, water, and chemical signals across entire forest ecosystems, provides a model of distributed relational agency that the dominant philosophical frameworks are, by their own logic, unable to account for. The project finds conceptual resources through merging the ecological phenomenon of mycorrhizal networks, the rhizomatic philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari, the phenomenological literature on psilocybin, and African indigenous epistemologies. The argument is not advanced as a rival system of normative principles, but rather as an alternative way of thinking about ethics altogether, one whose lineage runs through the existentialist and relational philosophers to whom the presentation now turns. The ethics of care tradition originated through rupture and provocation, with Carol Gilligan's challenge to Kohlbergian models of moral development, which she argued privileged an orientation toward abstract principles and individual rights. She argued that this privileging reflected masculine socialization and marginalized an orientation toward relationships and context. Thereafter, Joan Tronto argues that care should be understood as a political practice. Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's Matters of Care reflects the most significant attempt to extend the tradition toward non-human worlds, arguing for a speculative reopening of care to encompass multi-species and more than human concerns. Genevieve Lloyd's The Man of Reason provides the foundational analysis of the androcentric structuring of the Western philosophical tradition, arguing that the association of reason with masculinity is constitutive of the tradition from Plato to Kant. However, the project positions care ethics less within the lineage of normative theory than within the alternative tradition of existentialist and relational thought. A useful resource in this regard is Simone de Beauvoir's work. Normative theories of consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics each organize moral life around the derivation of right conduct from a principle or a rule, or some settled account of the good. However, Beauvoir's ethics of ambiguity begins from a negation of that ambition. She argues that ethics lies in the responsible exercise of freedom under conditions that admit no final settlement. Therefore, the organizing question is not which rules ought to govern action, but rather how free and embodied beings might live responsibly amid ambiguity, interdependence, and oppression. Beauvoir's insistence that freedom is intrinsically relational and that individual freedom is realized through the freedom of others is particularly important for providing the conceptual ground that an ethics of care requires, and that the normative traditions organized around the sovereign agent are structurally unable to provide. Read alongside Lloyd, Beauvoir's analysis of woman as the other in The Second Sex also reveals the gendered structure of the atomistic subject that my project sets out to displace. One limitation of this literature is that it has remained insufficiently attentive to the broader challenge of situating ethical thought within a non-anthropocentric and non-arborescent philosophical paradigm. Puig de la Bella Casa gestures toward this challenge without fully resolving it. and Beauvoir herself reserves the ethical relation for beings capable of assuming their freedom. So Beauvoir is not interested in plants and animals, and certainly not fungi. The project takes these unresolved gestures and the limits internal to them as its starting point. Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus provides the conceptual framework for the project through their concept of the rhizome. The rhizome is a model of thought that grows horizontally rather than vertically and proliferates through connection, multiplicity, and asignifying rupture, as opposed to through hierarchy and descent. The rhizome provides the counter-ontology to the arboreal model that my project critiques. Deleuze's difference and repetition supplies a counterpart to this alternative, since the arborescent model is the spatial form of what he names the dogmatic image of thought. Thus, the same body of writing provides both the critique of the atomistic subject and the relational ontology proposed in its place. Val Plumwood's environmental culture and Timothy Morton's dark ecology extend this tradition in directions relevant to the project's ecological concerns. Morton's concept of the dark ecological object, irreducible to human categories, and resistant to the nature versus culture distinction, relates to the post-utopian framing of the mycelial heuristic. While Plumwood's analysis of the logic of dualism and how the mind, body, culture, nature, and reason emotion distinctions reproduce a single logic of dominance provides a kind of bridge between the Cartesian diagnosis and the feminist critique. Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life and Anna Tsing's The Mushroom at the End of the World provide empirical and philosophical sources for the mycelial model. Sheldrake's account of mycorrhizal network research provides the ecological grounding for the project's philosophical argument, demonstrating that the distributed, non-hierarchical relational agency that the rhizome describes is a material ecological state. Tsing's multi-species anthropology positions this ecology within the conditions of neoliberal capitalism. She argues that collaborative survival in damaged landscapes requires attending to the entangled relations that market logic renders invisible. This can be identified in Chapter 2 of The Mushroom at the End of the World, where Tsing identifies the premise of neoclassical economics as the self-contained individual actor out to maximize personal interests, while the important stuff for life on Earth happens in those transformations, not in the decision trees of self-contained individuals. A mycelial ethics of care foregrounds these conditions through its engagement with mycorrhizal networks and the commons. Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble and Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass provide political and epistemological lenses. Kimmerer's sustained account of Potawatomi plant epistemology is meaningful as a demonstration that indigenous botanical knowledge constitutes a distinct epistemological tradition. The selection of Southern African case studies and indigenous epistemologies requires methodological care. The project does not treat indigenous epistemologies as a single homogeneous category. The project engages with specific traditions and thinkers. Thus, the focus will be on Lewis Williams's scholarship on San shamanic practice and rock art, van der Merwe et al. On ethnographic accounts of indigenous psilocybin use, Ramos's account of the relational ontology embedded in Southern African philosophical thought, and Kimmerer's Potawatomi plant epistemology. My own position as a white South African engaging with these traditions is acknowledged as a methodological constraint that requires reflexivity and care. Ramos's account of African philosophy and the relational ontology of Motu ke Motu Kabatu connects with the Mycelial Ethics of Care. His account relates to the Mycelial Ethics of Care through his insistence that personhood is constitutively relational. And David Lewis Williams's scholarship on San rock art provides the specific historical grounding for the project's engagement with indigenous psychedelic use in Africa. Insofar as his argument that the rock art tradition reflects shamanic states of consciousness is supported by an extensive body of archaeological and comparative evidence. However, the claim that Southern African indigenous practice sustains a relational, more than human engagement with psilocybin is advanced very carefully, since the documentary record is limited. Until recently, evidence of traditional psilocybin use on the continent was effectively absent, confined to speculative readings of Saharan rock art. It is only with the description of psilocybe maluti by van der Merwe et al. That a first-hand account has been recorded by Basotho healers in the Laribe district of northern Lesotho. This evidence is anecdotal and ethnographically thin, and it cannot be assimilated to the San trance practices examined elsewhere in the project, which are induced through rhythmic dance rather than ethnogens. Therefore, the project treats the Basotho material as singular, carefully sourced, itself the product of a collaborative study co-authored with a Basotho healer of the relational epistemology that the mycelial heuristic seeks to think alongside. Steve Biko's Black consciousness philosophy appears in the 5th chapter of the project as a political historical witness to the epistemological suppression enacted by colonial governance. Mbembe's On the Post-Colony, Manolio and Walsh's On Decoloniality provide the broader post-colonial and decolonial arguments. Vandana Shiva's Monocultures of the Mind functions as a theoretical bridge between the post-colonial and ecological dimensions of the argument, insofar as her diagnosis of monoculture as one of colonialism's epistemological mechanisms resonates with Deleuze and Guattari's critique of arborescent thought. This is illustrated through Shiva's argument that monocultures are an instrument of impoverishment for the powerless and for nature. However, the colonization of the mind precedes this by relegating forms of knowledge that do not fit the framework of reductionist science to be categorized as non-knowledge. According to Sheldrake, One of the most robust mental models is that of the self. It is exactly this sense of self that psilocybin and other psychedelics seem to disrupt. The well-defended I that humans depend on for so much can vanish entirely or just dwindle, shading off into otherless gradually. The result, feelings of merging with something greater and a reimagined sense of one's relationship to the world. In recent years, scholarly literature on psychedelic research has grown significantly. The clinical work of Carhart Harris and colleagues at Imperial College London, particularly their neuroimaging studies of psilocybin's effects on the default mode network, provides empirical grounding for my phenomenological argument. Thomas Metzinger's Being No One and his account of the phenomenal self model provide an argument for understanding what happens when the ego boundary is suspended. However, the project treats Metzinger as a complicated ally, given his skepticism towards the evidential standing of first-person reports. Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception offers a more sympathetic resource, in that his account of the pre-personal, embodied subject provides a phenomenological critique of the Cartesian subject within which the psilocybin argument can be situated, and which connects the existentialist tradition to the rhizomatic ontology. The significant gap in this literature is the absence of any sustained engagement with the ethical implications of psychedelic phenomenology. The empirical and clinical literature focuses on therapeutic outcomes, while the philosophical literature explores consciousness and selfhood. However, neither has connected these to the tradition of care ethics, nor to the question of how the more than human world might be taken seriously as an ethical domain. This project aims to fill that gap, while acknowledging that phenomenological intensity does not automatically establish ontological validity, and that any argument from psilocybin experience to claims about the nature of reality requires elaboration. The project does not argue that psilocybin experiences are authoritative because of their phenomenological intensity, or because experiences of ego dissolution feel true. Resonances between the phenomenology of psilocybin experience and the ontological claims about the relational subjectivity involve several related claims. The first is derived from Metzinger and is supported by Merleau-Ponty's critique of the Cartesian subject, which holds that ordinary ego consciousness is itself a construction. Second, the empirical neuroscientific evidence drawn from Carhart, Harris, and colleagues that psilocybin produces measurable changes in the neural substrates of self-representation. And third, a comparative epistemological argument for why altered states of a specific kind, those that dissolve ego boundary, for example, constitutes a relevant source of evidence for claims about relational ontology. The project acknowledges that psychedelic experiences can equally produce narcissism and anxiety and are increasingly subject to commodification. Growing empirical literature on psychedelic research, including the clinical work of Carhart Harris and colleagues at Imperial College London involving neuroimaging studies, demonstrate that psilocybin significantly reduces activity in the default mode network, or the DMN. The DMN is the neural substrate of the ego boundary, the sense of a bounded and individual self. Their studies also found that psilocybin produces a corresponding increase in the connectivity between brain regions that do not ordinarily communicate. According to Sheldrake, the study showed that subjects who reported the strongest sense of ego dissolution or loss of a sense of self on psilocybin had the most dramatic reductions in the activity of their DMNs. Shut down the DMN and the brain is let off the leash. Cerebral connectivity explodes, and a tumult of new neural pathways arises. Networks of activity previously distant from one another start to link up. The phenomenological dissolution of the ego boundary characterizes a psilocybin experience. So, if the sense of being a bounded and individual subject is itself a neural construction, then the relational and distributed subjectivity that the Mycelial Ethics of Care proposes is a phenomenologically accessible state. Elaborating on what the dissolution of the DMN makes possible, Sheldrake draws on Matthew Johnson, stating that psychedelics open a window of mental flexibility in which people can let go of the mental models we use to organize reality. I draw on the philosophical phenomenology of Thomas Metzinger, whose account of the phenomenal self model provides a conceptual framework for understanding what happens when that model is suspended. In Being No One, Metzinger claims that the brain simulates the self as a transparent self model, and no such things as selves exist in the world. Nobody ever was or had a self. Metzinger argues that the self is a process of constructed representation. Thus, it makes sense that experiences which interrupt this representation, including psychedelic experience, can produce philosophical insight into the constructed identity of ordinary subjectivity. Similarly, from within phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty dismantles Descartes' res cogitans, a rational, self-enclosed subject, stating that there is no inner man. Man is in and toward the world, and it is in the world that he knows himself. When I return to myself from the dogmatism of common sense and of science, I do not find a source of intrinsic truth, but rather a subject destined to the world. In this regard, psilocybin alters consciousness and reveals experientially and argumentatively the contingency of the atomistic subject and the possibility of a different relationship to the non-human world. The theoretical framework of this project is organized around what might be called rhizomatic or mycelial thinking. In this case, rhizomatic or mycelial thinking is a philosophical paradigm that understands knowledge, ethical relations, and the composition of a text itself as a process of multiplicity and lateral growth. In Deleuze's terms, this is a shift from the dogmatic image of thought, which organizes philosophy around a unified subject in search of foundations, to complexity thinking, that understands all relations as distributed and entangled. So the project proposes a distinction between two modes of scholarly engagement. Firstly, deep dive analytical engagement, which is the mode appropriate to single problem studies that seek the exhaustive treatment of a narrow domain. Secondly, broad sweep associative engagement, which is the mode appropriate to studies that seek to demonstrate connections across domains that have been artificially separated. The present project defends the latter on the basis of a performative argument. To argue for a mycelial ethics of care using a single problem and arboreal methodology would be a performative contradiction. The project's mode of composition must be adequate to its own philosophical commitments. Although the Hobbesian organizing strategy of asking what the nature of a problem is, how it arose, what its effects are, and how those effects might be responded to provides the scaffold for each chapter. This functions as what Deleuze and Guattari would call a strategy of temporary territorialization. This organizational heuristic imposes sufficient structure for argument and insight to emerge without claiming to be the essential pathway to truth. The overarching aim of this presentation was to show you my development of a mycelial ethics of care as a philosophical heuristic that is adequate to the specific conditions of ecological precarity and institutional failure that characterize post-apartheid South Africa. Anat Singh reminds us that we do not live in intact systems, but among ruins, the blasted landscapes left behind by progress. Mycelial Ethics of Care asks whether we can live in ruins, metabolize harm, and sustain relational life amid precarity. Now, what I would like to know from you all, what do you think? Do you think a mycelial heuristic of care could provide an alternative way of thinking about ethical relations between human and non-human life? What do you think are the implications of this for institutional life in post-apartheid South Africa? And also, how does this research make you feel? Thanks for coming on this journey with me. I know it was a bit of a wild one. I do hope that you have questions for me. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Fab. Anzel, thank you so much. That was amazing. Would you like to take your PowerPoint down and then we can kind of engage with your full being? Yeah, I have thousands of questions, but I see that there are lots of hands coming up. So first Adrian and then Werner.
Hi everyone. Hi Anzel. Thanks for an amazing presentation. Wow, you've really got your work cut out for you in the best way. And yeah, I was just curious. This might be jumping too much towards the sort of end result of the project, but just if you had any ideas around it. On the one hand, you speak about what seems to be implied as the personal, individual experience of kind of the psilocybin and connection. And then the mycelial ethics of care, which even though it doesn't follow the usual normative framework, still kind of speaks about groups of people. How might we live as free, connected individuals? And I'm just wondering, firstly, how do those two, I can see how they connect vaguely, but how do they connect for you? And then also, um, what does this mycelial ethics of care actually look like once the connection's been realized? I think. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Should I just go ahead and I'll deal with Adrian and then I'll jump to Werner?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks for your question, Adrian. So that's a very good question. Um, I suppose think of it kind of like the mycelial heuristic is kind of tied to the mycelium, right? And that's this interconnectedness, that's the wood wide web, that's the connection, that's this like rhizomatic, right? And then the psilocybin is like the fruit of the labor That makes sense. Yeah, the psilocybin is like the fungi. It's the fruit of that labor. And that's kind of where that connection comes in. Right now, I understand if that doesn't make sense to you. Does that make sense?
No, it does. That does make sense. I think what that kind of sparks maybe a more precise question, which is, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but in introducing this ethics of care, like which one comes first? Is it the personal realization of connection, or is it I think that's what I'm trying to tease out. Which one, and then what are the like societal implications or frameworks of living as these connected beings? If you have any ideas on that, it's just fascinating.
I think kind of like how the rhizome is, which I mean I can't submit a rhizome for my PhD, which I would love to, but I can't because that would just be crazy. Um, but think of it kind of like it's not it's both and. It's like yeah, Pierre Hadot both and sort of logic. It's not that the one came first and then the other one. It's kind of it's both and. Um, I hope that makes sense. And then you had another question about, oh, how do we actually see this? So it's all pretty talky, but what does this look like, right? Um, I don't know. I'm hoping that it will look like, especially perhaps at university level, the way that we teach ethics, that maybe that could shift a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit. Um, so that we can bring in this more kind of alternative views and ideas around ethics. Um, and then, man, I would love for psilocybin to be legalized. I would love for someone to care enough about this because I'm obsessed. I would love for someone in the government to look at this and think, oh, wow, maybe this could look different. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks. Thank you.
Good luck with that. Yeah. No, I'm being cynical. Vanna.
Firstly, thank you, Anzel. That was very, very fascinating. As Andrea might have briefly mentioned, I work in psychedelic phenomenology. And I found it very fascinating how you managed to link all these different things together. I'm also coming up on writing a chapter on ethics of care and how this relates to psychedelic therapy. So I got some useful resources from you. Thank you for that. As for my question, this relates to your use of Metzinger in relation to Merleau-Ponty. So Metzinger's account of the self as a model, which is based on predictive processing, presents a model of the mind that is inextricably skull-bound, meaning there is no actual access to reality. You only have access to the model of reality. And this is the consequence that I don't see how you can apply this to any relational ontology. If there's no way for me to access anything other than my constructed reality, even though through a psychedelic experience I can realize that it's a construct and I can see how it's built, I can have what Metzinger would call an experience of pure consciousness, but there's no point at which I can actually have a rhizomic experience, to use the phraseology that you were using. This poses a bit of a problem. So I would like to know how you think about going about this, because I understand why you want to get to a relational ontology. And just as this tied to Merleau-Ponty, then this would also go against a phenomenological understanding of the self as constituted within the world, right? As a being that is already within the world means that it's a being that's already in relation to other beings. These are things that actually exist. These aren't models of each other, if you understand what I'm trying to get at. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Um, so when I was, I'll just be totally honest with you. I struggle with Metzinger, and I struggled a lot with this section. It was when I say it took, oof, it took a long it and it made me feel really crazy. It made me feel really crazy because I hadn't arrived there yet. I was on the mycelial train, and I was doing a lot of research into the Wood Wide Web and all of that. And Merleau-Ponty was kind of like a way to, I was like, okay, Metzinger is not going to work. And that came early. That came soon because it took a lot of work and a lot of reading. And I was just like, this is not going to work. And so I thought that it was kind of last minute before this is recording, but that's okay. Last minute before I submitted my proposal, I was like, this is not going to work. I need to close this hole. And so I reached for Merleau-Ponty through, I don't know why. I think it was because I knew that there was a connection between him and Simone de Beauvoir because I went down a bit of a Simone rabbit hole, and I was reading Letters to Sartre, and then I was like, oh, Merleau-Ponty, that's the way to go. Um, but I don't know. I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't know. And I could be so wrong. And I have hit, it's not an impasse, but I'm hoping there's a way. Do you have any advice for me?
I can say two things that might be helpful. One, the same model of mind that Metzinger makes use of, a representationalist model of mind. It's the same model of mind that Carhart Harris them use in their work as well. So this criticism is not limited to Metzinger. This also goes to what is perhaps seen as the leading psychedelic researcher in the world right now. They all use predictive processing and Bayesian brain models. If you wish to stick with Metzinger, because he's very good, I recommend reading his book, The Elephant and the Blind. It's a 2024 publication, in which he uses phenomenology to study meditation, even though he still sticks to his idea of selfhood as like this model idea of selfhood. He does a lot of good phenomenological work in extrapolating what stuff like pure consciousness is, what is a minimal form of selfhood, and these kinds of questions that are definitely relevant to psychedelic experience. I think with your ethics of care and your eco-phenomenology, you're on the right track. Just don't make the mistake that assuming when Metzinger says this is what a mind is, that that's the same mind that phenomenologists are referring to. Yeah.
Sorry, guys, I'm making notes like crazy.
Don't worry, it's recorded. You can go back. In the meantime, are there other questions or comments, thoughts? Hand up, Simran,
Hi
and then
everyone. Hi,
Adrian
Prof.
after that. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Anzel. Thank you so much for this presentation. What a fascinating topic. My question is a little bit basic, but I'd like to know what what on earth drew you to this type of topic, and then maybe if you could comment on um, the the interlinking of Black consciousness and yeah, just this topic and how it relates to the reality of South Africa today.
Thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it, Simran. Thank you. And thank you, Werner. I'm going to send you an email. I'm going to slide into your emails. Um, so what drew me to this? Or let me talk on Biko first, because I love Biko. Why Biko? Um, when I was engaging with Vandana Shiva's monocultures of the mind, I was kind of confronted with seeing this, particularly at universities, where some kinds of knowledge are kind of seen as less than or not considered knowledge. Um, and I don't know why I went to Biko, but I think it's because Biko played such a massive role in me even wanting to study philosophy. I discovered Biko as a teenager, and he completely shifted the way that I thought about the world. And I reread I Write What I Like while I was busy starting to conceptualize this project. And I was just like, the monoculture of the mind, that is what happened under, that is apartheid consciousness. That is apartheid mentality. And so that is why I immediately had to go to Biko's Black Consciousness, because it kind of, it takes that and it inverts it at some level. I hope that answers your question. Um, and then regarding why this topic, um, a couple of years ago, I took a bit of a trip to and I should clarify, not a psychedelic trip, a trip with a car driving. Um, I drove to Namibia and I got lost. I drove into the desert and I made some bad turns and I made a big mistake and I got lost in just off of the Brandberg, close to a place called Uys, and in a dry riverbed in the dry Ugab River. And I got so lost, massively lost, almost died, got lost all alone by myself, no signal, nothing. And I only had a map, but I had no idea where I was in relation to the map. And when I started kind of losing hope and making peace that I may very well reach my end here, and after a series of other somewhat unfortunate events with some spitting cobras and some very angry elephants, I noticed that there were these mushrooms percolating along the dry riverbed, and I was just struck by how I didn't know that mushrooms grew in the ruins of the desert. Um, and that prompted this just fascination and obsession with fungi and with mushrooms. I hope that answers your question.
Ansel, I'm glad you made it back. That's quite a frightening story, but nothing like trauma, hey, to trigger an obsession. We have a few minutes, maybe one last burning question if there is. Oh, Adrian, sorry, I nearly forgot about you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to make a comment on the whole the Metzinger discussion. I think that if you're looking for like phenomenological models of the mind and stuff, you don't really need Metzinger. I think like, yeah, even Sartre's subjecthood or consciousness, just a bare idea of consciousness as intentionality, and like even the more modern version of Husserl, Dan Zahavi, he makes in his argument for the minimal self, he makes like a bit of a throwaway claim in his one book that, you know, basically we could consider minimal selfhood as not just for humans, it's anyone that exhibits anything that exhibits a phenomenal consciousness. And already there you have like a leveling out of the playing field. I'm not sure what you would say about fungi, but there's lots to work with there without Metzinger, I think. Yeah.
I can see Werner nodding madly. So I suggest a three-way conversation. This would be quite interesting and useful. Maybe we'll try Wild Coast. We'll, see if we can get up a group of us to go and talk about fragmentation and the self, something like that. Okay, we've got 1 minute and I'm going to snatch it because I want to throw a little spanner in Anzel's works. I know. It was related to the thing that you said for your doctorate. I can't submit a rhizome. It would be crazy. And I think that's kind of interesting. You talk about that the analytical mode of processing, and you talk about that associative mode of processing, and you say, well, it's going to be associative, it's going to be rhizomatic, and yet at the same time you're saying it's crazy to do that. And I find that really telling, because you said it has to be both and. And I really think that's very important. I mean, what about a kind of a combination between aberrescent and rhizomatic processing, or between uh, entanglement? I mean, this is something I keep harping on with Brian Castellani too. Everyone's using the word entanglement as if it's a positive term, but it's flippin' horrible sometimes to be entangled, and all you want to do is straighten things out, get back to that tree. So it would be disconcerting to stay in a state of entanglement for too long, and also in a state of non-self or suspended self. If you want to suspend the DMN, you can't do it forever. You need to come back to something more kind of structured and ordered. So that's what I'm slightly missing, is that sense that it is a kind of a both and and it's an oppositional both and. So I mean, an aberrant way of thinking is contrary to a rhizomatic way of thinking, and yet you need them both, even though they both kind of pull in opposite directions. So that was just something I thought maybe I should throw in there at the tail end. If you'd like to comment, go for it. If you want to just say, oh, shush, I'm going to think about this much later, you do so too.
This is why, oh, I'm so happy. This is why you're my supervisor. That's why it's you. Because I am so traumatized by the institution and this imposing. And that's why I'm so happy that it's you and that you even said this, because now I'm like, well, this is fantastic, because let's do it. Let's submit a rhizome. So excited. I can't, I'm just so I'm beyond excited. I'm ecstatic. Thank you, Andrea, for that comment, and I've taken note of it and I will not let it go.
Right. Okay, I think unless there's really burning comments, but I think we're pretty much out of time. So Anzel, thank you. I think it was fascinating. I'm very glad we have it on YouTube, so we can all go back to it. And it's an incredibly rich and deep and an interesting presentation. So yeah, thank you so much for talking to us about this. And next week we will be chatting with a familiar face, Prof. Vulindlela Nyoni, and he will be talking about playing in making. And again, something to do with shifts in awareness. So we're kind of, it looks like our seminar is moving a lot towards play rather than game, which is fine. We had quite a lot of game in the beginning of the series. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you again all next week. And yeah, have a great playful rhizomatic weekend. Okay.